Hello, everybody. Welcome. I see our attendees starting to join. Welcome to Decarcerating Care, Part 2. Feel free, as people are joining us, to put in the chat where you're dialing in from, your name, what you do, anything you want to share, your interest in this event, why you're excited to be here. And we're going to get started in just a minute. Calling in from Oakland, New York City, Massachusetts, Texas, Canada, Seattle, Philadelphia, Milwaukee. Amazing. Welcome, everybody. So I'm just going to dive right in with a brief introduction to IDHA while people are introducing themselves, so we stay on schedule here. So welcome, everyone, to Decarcerating Care Part 2. My name is Jessie Roth, and I am the director of the Institute for the Development of Human Arts. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll just give a brief visual description of myself. I am a white femme presenting woman. I have dark brown hair. I have a bun on the top of my head, and I'm wearing a dark green turtleneck, and I have some houseplants behind me. And I hope everybody can also see our ASL interpreter. Feel free to write in the chat if that's not the case for you. So briefly, just to introduce IDHA. So we are a community of current and prior mental health service users, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other clinicians, as well as activists and artists who have all come together with this mission of transforming mental health care. And what we do here at IDHA is we are advancing critical, effective, and scalable alternative approaches to mental health through collaborative education and community development. And what makes us unique at IDHA is we live in a culture of professionalism, and what we're trying to do is integrate experiential and academic knowledge to challenge the idea that only those who work in the field of mental health are the quote unquote experts. We believe that this shifts power dynamics in a field that generally only privileges professional experience. And some quick community agreements for us this evening. The first is shared expertise and wisdom, that everyone brings their own expertise to the conversation. We can all gain from and respect each other's various expertise. Collective liberation, overcoming oppression aids everyone's liberation. It is our responsibility to challenge various forms of prejudice. We educate in the spirit of solidarity and hold each other accountable without criticizing who we are as people. And lastly, we listen like allies. We respect a wide diversity of choices and perspectives, even when we disagree, and we don't judge or invalidate other people's experiences. Couple of notes on accessibility. So we have live closed captioning available this evening. You should have a button in your controls to turn those on. If you have any challenges, Liza is in the chat as tech support, so feel free to reach out. And we also have 2 ASL interpreters joining us who will be swapping out periodically. And lastly, as I modeled with the visual description, we'll aim to provide these throughout the event, have our panelists introduce themselves. And a couple of other notes on tech. So I mentioned Liza is there to assist you with tech if you need anything. We are, as you can see, recording this event. You will get a copy later if you signed up. And if you want to submit any questions via the chat, we'll be keeping an eye on that, can feed questions to the panelists if we have time. Just know that we might not be able to get to all questions because we're hoping to have a pretty lively conversation. And yeah, so from here, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator this evening, Grace Ortez. The panelists will introduce themselves and we'll be digging into a Q&A. So with that, I thank you all again for joining, and I'm going to pass it over to Grace, and we can stop the screen share.
Good evening, community. My name is Grace Ortez. I'm super excited for tonight. My pronouns are she, her. For a visual description, I am an Indigenous Latinx woman with tan skin and long black hair, wearing beaded turquoise earrings and large glasses. Behind me are, well, mostly just a white wall. I'm really excited to be here again. I thank you all for showing up tonight and making space for this discussion. I already know how tremendously powerful it's going to be. Some of you may have attended or watched the first Decarcerating Care event in September of last year. The response to that discussion was absolutely remarkable and demonstrated the need for more conversations about this topic. Tonight's event was designed as a follow-up to continue the dialogue about the ways in which the mental health system can perpetuate carceral control and explore solutions and ways forward. I couldn't be more excited, as I've already expressed several times, for this convening today. It really means a lot to me, and you're going to find out why it has such a personal significance. I'm immensely appreciative, first and foremost, of IDHA for creating a platform for these transformative conversations to take place. First and foremost, I'd like to thank Jesse Roth, Lee Durham, and Liza Freed. These are all part of IDHA's diligent organizing team who put so much care and intention behind this event. You just heard from Jesse a moment ago about IDHA's background and purpose, and I can fully vouch for the supportive, empowering environment which IDHA provides. So if you aren't already involved, I hope this conversation will galvanize you into action. I am deeply honored to be a part of this discussion and to be sharing space with everyone virtually. To briefly introduce myself, again, my name is Grace Ortez. I'm a South Bronx native with Indigenous roots, serving my community as a prison abolitionist, community organizer, human rights activist, and advocate supporting the incarcerated and their loved ones. I'm a member of Urban Justice Center's Freedom Agenda, which I encourage you to look up. And I currently work as a community outreach coordinator at Dream Deferred Inc., a reentry organization uplifting formerly incarcerated lives in New York City. Now, my expertise in conversations about mental health comes both from my advocacy on behalf of members of my community and those who have experienced the trauma of incarceration, as well as my personal experience as someone living with mental illness. My own experience in the psychiatric care system was one of survival. I came into psychiatric care in pieces at a fragile moment in my life in which I had seemingly reached the very end of my rope. Honestly, you guys, I was deeply suicidal. I was dependent on substances to get through the days, and fully hopeless and despondent, thinking that my whole soul and psyche might never make a recovery from the violence and abuse which I had endured as a child. I had fully lost my light, and quite frankly, as some of you may relate to, I was at a point at which I was tired of fighting for my life. Somehow the system managed to leave me exponentially worse off. I started out as a survivor of severe childhood violence and trauma. And after taking the steps to finally seek out care in the psychiatric and mental health care systems, this system put me through traumas which made me carry the heavy weight of being a psychiatric survivor as well. It's so tragic when I think about it, that in my darkest hour of need, I had no alternatives to care and healing and had nowhere to go with my pain other than the broken systems in place. But the bigger tragedy is that my story is by no means noteworthy. It's merely a drop in a sea of stories of traumatic experiences in the psychiatric and mental health care systems. Each of our stories represents the failures of a system that society has seemingly accepted as unfixable. We need to recognize that this is purely a reflection of our society's stigmatization and devaluation of neurodivergent and disabled lives. Those who don't understand us and our experiences don't think we deserve any better than the harmful system that's currently in place. Tonight's event makes space for those experiences, voices, and stories. And let me make clear that while IDHA has created a platform for this conversation, we are in no way taking ownership over the discourse. This is merely part of a long-standing fight led by directly impacted disabled, neurodivergent folks, Black and Indigenous people of color, and the families and loved ones of those affected. We honor them with immense gratitude by continuing their work, ensuring that their contributions are never forgotten, and that the progress they fought for lives on by keeping reforms accountable to standards of equity and accessibility. We need to be intentional in ensuring that progress and transformation doesn't leave anyone behind. We cannot give up on each other. This is a moment to come together and to resist, to demand a better system, because who is more informed to shape a new system than those of us who have seen and been hurt by the flaws in the system that is currently in place? Systemic transformation is a matter of life or death, particularly for underserved and overpoliced Black and Brown communities, like the one I come from. We are in desperate need of community-based alternatives, and we can't afford to wait any longer. We'd like to encourage our community tonight to engage with this conversation. We're not just here for the purpose of talking at you, we want your thoughts. So please feel free to use the chat feature to express yourself. We will be making space during this event to take some questions from the audience, so please take advantage. We would love to hear from you. With that, I'd like to invite our panelists to introduce themselves. If you could all share your name, pronouns, a brief visual description, and go ahead and tell us what brings you into the discussion today. And let's go ahead and start with Yazin.
Hi, folks. Can everyone hear me okay? Excellent. My name is Yazan. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the community organizer at Vigilant Love. Just for a quick visual description, I'm wearing a dark green button-down shirt, a black long sleeve cardigan. I have my plants in the background, pothos plants hanging on yellow walls and wooden floors, and I have a very sunny apartment. I myself am non-binary, I'm wearing rimless glasses, and I have a buzzed head. So Vigilant Love is the organization that I work with very proudly. We're a healing justice and arts organization based out of Los Angeles. And a majority of our work is committed to challenging the structural and communal impacts of Islamophobia, especially with regards to the war on terror. A lot of my own work focuses on our Services, Not Surveillance campaign. And I support specifically in the political analysis, campaign strategy, and educational facilitation of that campaign. A lot of our own work in this campaign looks at the relationship between racialization of Muslim communities, the surveillance of Muslim communities, and the co-optation of health rhetoric to further the, ultimately, really the end of social justice organizing. And then lastly, I myself hold an MA in Women and Gender Studies from San Diego State University. And I do a lot of my own research looking at the relationship between war, migration, surveillance, and social welfare programming. And I just want to name that Vigilant Love is very excited and very grateful to be here. I think that this is a really powerful space, and I want to name that everyone on my team is very, very excited for this specific panel.
Yazin, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and ask Marco, who is a close friend and a brother to me, to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Marco Barrios. I'm a male, Colombian born, raised all my life here, a disabled veteran. I served during the Gulf War back in '91. During that time, when I came out, before I go into that, I am currently right now a criminal justice advocate with the Urban Justice Center. Our work is to end the criminalization of mental health concerns. And my line of work is to monitor the discharge planning services provided to people who receive mental health services in New York City jails. Now, going back to my experience in the military, when I came out, I was undiagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And unfortunately, I decided with no help, I started self-medicating myself. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in jail, facing 25 to life. I did 24 years and 6 months of that. And during that time, under those conditions, without no treatment, minimum treatment, especially no treatment for PTSD, I decided to do self-help treatment, reading books, and finally going to college and getting my degree in behavioral sciences. And I was starting also a cancer support group for men who were diagnosed with cancer. I never thought of ever going into jail, obviously. It was the worst nightmare. But with the help of God and others, I just decided that I was not going to die in there. And I was going to face those demons that I had. And from day one, I'm fortunate to say that I stood clean, or should I say sober. And it's been already 30 years from day one I went into prison. Not everybody has that opportunity. And especially in the prison setting, it's even worse. So when I came home in 2017, you can imagine how traumatized it was. Just a shock, the culture shock. It felt almost like when I came out of prison. I mean, when I came out of jail. I'm sorry. When I came out of war, the anxiety, the stress, not feeling that it fit in, but I was determined to make a change. And that's what I said when I went before the parole hearing. And they asked me what I do with my degree. And I told them that I would want to give back to the community and make a better future for my daughter. And she was a huge inspiration. Is a huge inspiration. The line of work I also do is making sure, like, criminal justice reforms. And I've been part. I'm proud to be part of the Close Rikers campaign and the Build Communities campaign, which focuses on investing into the communities that have been directly impacted by the criminal system. And finally, the last part we finally got passed was the Renewable Rikers, which closes this penal colony in the middle of New York City for over the last 80 years. And we're focused on environmental justice in that capacity. I'm just glad to be here, and I'd like to share a little bit more of my perspectives on such issues that come from my work and in personal experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. Can you guys hear me all right? Thumbs up? Awesome. Thank you. So now let's pass it on to Dustin. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings you into the conversations today.
Cool, thank you. My name is Dustin Gibson. I'm a light-skinned Black man with a beard. I have a black sweatshirt on, says "Free the People." I have a do-rag with headphones. In the back, you might be able to see some books. There's also some artwork that says "There are Black people in the future." I come to the work that I've been a part of for the last decade as a survivor of institutions. I've been both involuntarily and voluntarily committed into institutions. While on a voluntary commitment, that's when I learned that you're able to be held there indefinitely, depending on what the professional's decision is about what your state is. From that, I came out and I really understood myself in a larger context when I found the independent living movement. People like Milton Henderson, Cindy Williams are the people that gave me language to articulate and understand that I was a part of a lineage of people that have been struggling and that are also attempting to get other people free. So through the independent living movement, I worked at centers where we were on the ground, providing direct support to folks that are in institutions, so asylums, state hospitals, prisons, jails, nursing facilities, and attempting to get folks free. Since I've been really concerned with what does it look like on the other side when we are free, and how can we build a movement to be able to, as survivors of institutions, support other people in their freedom. So how we've done that is through the use of peer support groups. So that's building informal networks in Georgia, South Carolina, Maryland, Pennsylvania, where we're able to teach each other the things that we need to know just to navigate life and build those skills, but then also to find inroads to be able to find more of our people that want to get free. For the past year, I've worked at People's Hub, which is an online movement school. I came into People's Hub to work with Landry Williams, who is now our ancestor. But Landry being somebody that is queer, Black from the South with chronic illness, that worked in solidarity economy, understood the importance of being able to infiltrate, I guess, the movement spaces that already exist, and implement the theories of change around anti-ableism work and access. So at People's Hub, we focus on solidarity economy work, dismantling the far right, environmental justice and healing justice. And what we've done there is be able to like find community for disabled folks that are not necessarily out as disabled, don't have the language to articulate or describe their experience as I didn't 10 years ago, and figure out what it looks like for us to build together. So we've done that again with the use of peer support, and then some of our internal and external programs that we offer. Along with that, I would just say I just generally exist within community as somebody that floats between different coalitions and grassroots organizations that are concerned with abolition. I teach at high schools, kid jails, self-advocacy for disabled kids and young adults, and we try to get them into the peer support mode as well. I'll stop there.
I love it. That was so inspired. Thank you, Justin, or Dustin, I apologize. That was, I'm just even more hyped to hear you and everybody else speak. So let's go to Kendra. Go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about, again, what brings you to the discussion today.
So hi, bonsoir. My name is Kendra Mclaughlin. I use she, her, elle pronouns. I'm a white, femme-presenting woman with dark brown hair. It's tied back, I have bangs. I'm wearing a large round gold frame glasses and a striped dress. Behind me are some photo ledges with some art and some buttons on them, and a white wall. So I would like to first acknowledge my being a settler on unceded and unsurrendered Indigenous lands. I'm currently living in Tiohtià:ke, also known as Montreal in so-called Canada. I've lived in the city since 2020, when I moved from Ottawa, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Algonquin Nation, where I was doing my graduate studies in legal psychology at Carleton University. My research centered on the criminalization of mental illness, and specifically on how jury decision-making is affected by attitudes relating to race, gender, and mental health, specifically within insanity trials. Most recently, I've started writing about my research findings and those of others on my blog that can be found on Instagram, Criminalized Mentally Ill. I live with bipolar disorder and a carceral abolitionist and a disability justice advocate. The topic of criminalization in carceral responses to mental health is professionally and personally significant issue to me. I hope that through my writings, more people can access critical reflections and perspectives on mental health. When I'm not writing, I enjoy going on walks, drinking coffee, reading, lots of reading. I'm truly humbled to be amongst this excellent panel of people, and I truly look forward to learning from you all this evening.
Thank you, Kendra. And I especially want to thank you in particular for your acknowledgement of the Indigenous land that we are all residing in. As an Indigenous person, my family is primarily of Mayan descent. That's really meaningful, and I appreciate you normalizing that in your discussion. And I appreciate what you bring to the table as well. And I'm excited to hear everything you have to say. Now let's bring it to Victoria. Victoria, hi, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody who went before me. My name is Victoria, or Vicky. I go by she, her pronouns. I am a freelance journalist and author that writes about issues of incarceration and resistance. And let's see, what brought me to the work was seeing that the ways in which, now that we're talking about criminal justice reform and ways in which we should be addressing mass incarceration and dismantling it, the popularly proposed reforms and solutions often look a lot like jails and prisons themselves. So we're seeing ways in which mental illness and mental health has been criminalized and people have been incarcerated. And now what we're seeing is a shift towards carceral-like treatments and locking people up and involuntarily committing them in the same ways in which we would if they were in prisons. So that was a disturbing trend that I was seeing in this movement towards dismantling this gigantic 2.2 million people behind bars machine that we have. And then on a personal level, as somebody who has had friends with mental health issues, who've gone through mental health crises, and also as somebody who wants to work towards prison abolition, I am super excited to be part of this panel to hear and learn more about ways in which people are building that everyday abolition. How do we support one another through mental health issues and mental health crises? How do we build that support? How do we build those networks? How do we make sure that people aren't left with two options, which is to pick up the phone and call 911 because they are fearful that their loved ones might hurt themselves, or nothing? And that seems to be the question that gets asked all of the time. Brief visual description: I am a Chinese femme-presenting woman. I am wearing, what am I wearing? That is a good question. I am wearing owl earrings and a brown shirt that has flowers embroidered on it and beads. And I am in front of a combination of a red wall and a bookshelf filled with lots of books about prisons. I think that's it.
Awesome. Thank you, Victoria. It's a lovely shirt. And I encourage everybody to check out your work, to check out your latest book, Prison by Any Other Name, as was linked in the chat if you guys want to check that out. And again, I want to encourage you again to use that chat option to engage in this discussion with us. Again, we're not trying to talk at you here. This is a community effort, and you're all a very big part of it as people tuning in today. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into the questions. And the first one is for Victoria. So we want to know, in what ways do popular criminal justice reforms overlap with mental health services? And how do these so-called progressive reforms actually expand the reach of the carceral state?
Great. I think Marco, in his introduction, laid out beautifully and hauntingly and infuriatingly how prisons don't provide any sort of mental health treatment or any sort of support for folks who need mental health assistance, and instead just brutalize and punish them in all sorts of ways. And at the same time, what we're seeing is that an increasing awareness that there are a vast proportion of people with diagnosed mental illnesses and mental health needs filling our jails and prison system. I think the latest statistic is that 64% of people in jails, in local jails, which means that many of them are in jail awaiting their day in court or awaiting trial. 56% of people in state prisons and 45% of people in federal prisons all have a diagnosed mental illness, which means that these are only the people that have a mental health diagnosis attached to them are behind bars. And what we're seeing is, with this recognition, calls for carceral facilities such as mental health jails or jails and prisons to expand to provide mental health services, instead of asking the more critical question of what can we be doing in our communities to support people, rather than locking them up for criminalized actions or actions that have been criminalized because of their mental health status, and then putting that funding into jails and prisons. One of the fights a few years ago, and maybe Yasmin can, might know more about what ended up happening, was a fight in Los Angeles where there was going to be a mental health, in California, and I believe it was Los Angeles, where they were going to build a mental health jail. And it was not going to be a mental health facility where if somebody from the community needed help and support could go in and access services, and instead you would have to be arrested for something, and then the police officer or whoever would designate that you should go to the mental health jail where you would supposedly get services. But the first point of contact would be to be arrested, rather than saying, we're seeing that a number of people need mental health services and are not getting them. And many of these people are ending up getting arrested and being jailed and perhaps being sentenced to prison. What can we do to support them? So I was seeing more talk about things like mental health jails, talk about putting more funding into the carceral system as mental health providers. We've seen again and again that police are often the first responders for mental health crises and mental health interventions, and that often ends brutally, if not tragically, in so many cases. And then at the same time, we're now also seeing this idea that we should be shifting away from carcerality, whether it be people who are in jail for, I don't know, nonviolent drug offenses or other criminalized actions. And we're seeing an increase in ideas that people need to reform the system so that people who have mental health issues can be placed in mental health treatment, either mandated treatment or involuntary psychiatric confinement. And what this does basically is it takes this idea of carcerality and everything about it, confinement, the loss of bodily autonomy, the loss of ability to control any of your actions, and puts them into another setting, which is not called prison. It is not called jail. You have not necessarily broken the law or been convicted of a crime, but you are still being confined. You're being told when to get up, when to eat, when to sleep, when and what medications you should be taking, whether you can see your family or your loved ones, etc. And then rather than being places where people receive support or help, they end up being punished instead. So I think that as we start thinking about ways in which we want to dismantle the prison system, we need to remember that we don't want to take those bricks and bars and barbed wire and build little mini prisons over here that are supposed to be the alternatives. What we want to do is dismantle the system and say we are just getting rid of all of this rubble, and we're going to build something totally new on its place instead that actually helps people.
Thank you, Victoria. That was incredible. I think we're all really, shook by that answer. And I appreciate you calling out the carcerality of the idea of, again, moving people with mental health needs from, like, oh, let's create this new system that we put them in, but that inherently is another carceral system. So in that way, we need to be careful about what these reforms, the detail of these reforms, right? And I appreciate you calling out the statistic as well, because that's something that I think it's very alarming, right? When you hear that most people that have been involved in the criminal justice system have a mental health diagnosis. And that should be a call to action to all of us to what a critical need this is. And that these are people with mental health needs. Violence and transgressions do not occur in a vacuum. So I appreciate your thoughts and your perspective. My next question is for Kendra. In hopes of connecting the past to the present, can you speak to the criminalization of mental illness or neurodivergence over time? What tactics or themes persist in these efforts to practice social control?
I think that's a great question. And to build off Victoria's excellent points, I think to understand the history and the transformation of the criminalization of mental illness and neurodivergence, it's useful to think of confinement. So confinement of people into spaces where they do not have autonomy or say in their lives, be it in psychiatric spaces, in slavery, in prisons. We can also consider the historical shift that the last couple of centuries have had away from undifferentiated confinement to a more specialized and differentiated form of confinement that we have today. But regardless of the specialized nature and locations and conditions, they all have the same philosophy, and that's to bring disabled, criminal, and uncivilized people to normative standards under constant watch. These spaces of confinement can be institutions as well, and should also be considered on a continuum due to their interrelated histories and purposes. So for example, institutionalization is also incarceration. It's not analogous to prisons, but they're interconnected. A straightforward way to think of institutions is any place, facility, or program where people do not have control over their lives. So what is the purpose of confinement in institutions? Well, if you ask mental health reformers or prison reformers, these institutions, including prisons, should be spaces of care, usually with the goal of making people productive citizens. The type of confinement and care people experience is most certainly related to the patient's or prisoner's race, their gender, their sexuality, their disability, and their class. Confinement and care has historically been and currently tends to be structured based on a person's race and class, as well as their gender. And for these reasons, it's important to always keep structures of power and domination, such as racism, sexism, transphobia, sanism, ableism, capitalism, in mind when we're considering how to address these big issues in a critical way. So with those big power structures in mind, let's turn our attention to a story or narrative that I'm sure most of you folks have heard when we think about the criminalization of mental illness or neurodivergence. So I'm certain most people here are familiar with the narrative of trans-institutionalization, big word, just to say that people move from one institution to another. So how people who were mentally ill or neurodivergent were moved from one institution, psychiatric hospitals, to prisons. Oftentimes, I think the common narrative often frames this institution hopping, if you will, as due to some inherent characteristic of people who are mentally ill or neurodivergent. At worst, this narrative frames people who are mentally ill, mad, or neurodivergent as specifically dangerous and unpredictable, so their confinement is a given or even necessary. A perhaps more sympathetic view held by some people of the public is, well, these folks, they ended up on the streets after being in psych wards, then they became homeless, and then homeless people interact with the law and the police, and then these same folks become incarcerated. So this concept that I'm sure most of you are familiar with is usually simplified to the prisons are the new asylums argument, or the failure of deinstitutionalization. So think about the story. I'm sure you've heard about it. I know I sure have, and I certainly believed it at one point. It tends to be the narrative that many people are taught, including in universities. The framing of the failure of deinstitutionalization is also an insultingly false one, considering that deinstitutionalization was a patient-led movement and a disability rights and prisoner rights struggle for freedom. If anything was a failure, it was the neoliberal cuts to social services soon after people were deinstitutionalized. Deinstitutionalization is an abolitionist movement, and it was a success. The failure was that of the state, which privileged the few rather than the rest of us. Am I low on time now?
Just enough time to get another sentence or two out. I really don't want to cut you off, but you have a little bit of time left.
Okay, so I guess folks might be wondering, is the second narrative really that bad? So it seems to be more sympathetic. It's a fair thought, but I encourage you to challenge it. It ignores some really important things, and that is capitalism and neoliberalism's cut to social safety nets in Canada and the US during the 1980s, which happened to be around the same time that people were deinstitutionalized. There were also cuts to education, to housing, to health, and this is often overlooked in the narrative that we often hear. So I'll leave it at that, and I'll add my later points another time.
Thank you, Kendra. And again, I encourage everyone participating in the audience to take some time to, look into the work of all of our panelists today. They have so much to bring, as you can see, and so much passion and energy for this topic. So Kendra has a lot more to speak on this, and I would love for her to, get to more chances to connect with you guys and to share, what she has studied, what she has lived through, and the perspective that she has shaped from that. So please go ahead and, find our panelists after this and support their work. Now, we actually have time for an audience question, and I really appreciate this question because I think it centers the needs of people struggling with mental health in the now, and an actionable step that practitioners can take, right? So that question is, and I'm going to open this up to any panelists, please feel free to jump in. How can social workers and other mental health care professionals aligned with abolition, anti-racism, and decolonization honor people's rights to discuss suicide and ideation while they may fear police involvement, institutionalization, or being criminalized, especially with mandated reporting?
I'll hop on, I guess.
Thank you.
So I think at the core of all of this is for these situations to be client or patient led. So I think providing your client a space in which they feel safe that they can discuss these matters is key. I think most professionals too can really determine whether there's a real risk that the person is going to cause harm versus when there probably is, they're just talking through ideas and feelings. I don't know so much about the laws specifically. Yeah, I wonder if somebody else has some ideas on how to navigate the logistics and legal aspects of that.
This is Dustin. This is probably an illegal aspect of that. So maybe somebody else could talk about the law, but I'm thinking of a situation that I was a part of where a young person expressed that they had suicidal ideations, and this happened within a school. And this was over time of building with the class. And they expressed that the bell rang and it was time to go. And the teachers came in. Their immediate response was that they needed to call 911 essentially, and they were going to 302, which means involuntarily commit the student. And in that time, it literally just required like an act of solidarity from students to say that we're not leaving the classroom, for us to sit in front of the door and like really talk it out, and then like talk to the principal, talk to teachers, and it ended up the student not being committed at all. And it was a conversation that transpired and built supports, and the parents got involved. But I say that to mention that under a mandated reporting system, like you have to report that, right? You have to call the police and in order to keep your job and save that. So I mention it because it requires like solidarity, which is often like associated with taking some level of risk. So when we're thinking about how we can be abolitionists, but then uphold the very system that is perpetuating prisons and the carceral system and the psych wards, it puts us in a dilemma. And I feel like the situations are very individualized and you have to make those choices, but the choice every time cannot be to go with what the system tells you to do, because it will require like you risking your job at times, you risking something in order to stop something from happening.
This is a hard pivot, but I think something that also comes up in relation to this question that came to my mind is in the larger context of counterterrorism and mental health, which I'll be talking a little bit about, suicide and ideation are actually also risk factors that allow for the Department of Homeland Security to intervene in specific contexts, especially if you're thinking about youth who express interest in going abroad to fight US military in countries like Syria or Somalia. And so I think with the kinds of framings that Victoria was talking about at the beginning, it's this pseudo concern or care for what might happen to this person if they were to do that. And it's framed as we are concerned with this person or the others they might harm, but actually the entire well-being of this person and what they're thinking through, and also their autonomy in deciding what they want to be doing and what they want to risk and for who and for what gets entirely erased in the name of health and care and concern, because it's also depoliticizing their context and depoliticizing their specific framework, and instead framing it into a, we're concerned for this person, we're concerned for the people around them. And so I know that this isn't necessarily about what service providers directly can do. I was going to touch a bit on that later on, but I think specifically for thinking about how suicide and ideation gets manipulated, a lot of case studies that we've looked at, that's one of the things that happens, is a reference to suicide or a reference to being willing to die for a cause is considered something that needs to be intervened with for health reasons or like care concern, which I think is also important to name.
Thank you all again. I appreciate you all bringing such different points of view and concerns to the table and responding to this question. And it really is such an outrageous thing if we think about it. I remember myself having moments of, obviously, as I've shared, struggled with suicidal ideation, and immediately, instead of having to be able to be concerned about my welfare, suddenly starting to think about the legal implications of reaching out and like vocalizing these concerns, and also with helping folks in the community, helping incarcerated folks who have shared these feelings as well. And again, my friends, I come from a community that has a lot of systemic trauma, and it's just ridiculous, and points out all the flaws in the way that our system operates, right? When we have people more concerned for how, taking their lives would have some kind of, or vocalizing that and seeking help has legal implications, and they can't be human-centered. I appreciate that question very much in the way that it centers the experiences of people dealing with their mental illness. So we want to go back into our questions, and the next one is for Dustin. Again, Dustin, I appreciate everything you've shared so far. And I think, as I'm seeing in the chat, a lot of people appreciate what you brought up in response to the audience question. Now, this next question is, how does the legacy of deinstitutionalization impact the delivery of services and supports within mental health? What do you see as barriers to self-determination and dignity?
Hey, this is Dustin. So I want to be clear that deinstitutionalization itself is not just a movement that is solely concerned with mental health, although we're talking about it in this realm. And to know that the problems exist like in a larger, much broader system of what I would call uncare, which is like the intentional lack or absence of care that happens in mental health systems, along with other systems that are purportedly there to support disabled people and elderly folks. So they're a part of ableism, which manifests itself in like the overall criminalization of disability, which I view kind of like Kendra said is the enforcement of normalcy, which is like this white supremacist standard of how we should hear, how we should walk, think, see, behave, produce, just how we should exist. In the way we treat disabled people and the needs that we have are like through this idea that is somehow special. Like even the way in which we talk about mental illness or psychiatric disabilities is oftentimes like framed as like a mental health need, when that's something that like we literally all have like mental health needs, right? So even in the like the way that we articulate it, like we specialize it, and that helps us, at least me, it helps to be able to like create like a separate container for it. So that looks different in society, right? It could be an institution, it could be a group home, it could be a psych ward, but we're parsing it out based on like how we're thinking about what the needs are. And at base level, I should just say that like society is deeply uncomfortable with disabled people existing as we do. And that's acknowledged. It's been legislated, it's been pathologized, it's been medicalized, it's been upheld and affirmed by courts, from Black codes, the ugly laws, to the Buck v. Bell decision, to excited delirium, or disabilities that have been like created or projected on the folks, like hysteria. And people ask for this. Like we have institutions because people ask and advocate for them. One of the things that is often missed is that the existence of institutions current day, because although we had a movement to close them, they're still open. And there are still people that are trapped there. And the major resistance to that is sometimes unions, and oftentimes family members and parents. So it's important to note that people are like still saying that we need institutions for folks. But I'm thinking of the movement understood from a medical model, and the people that were part of deinstitutionalization movement understood that that model, the service model, where you drop something off and it gets repaired and then you bring it back, is something that festers violence. And it's operating on this idea that between speed and quality, like Erving Goffman talks about as sociologist, if speed and quality are the two factors that you have, the speed is easy to do and the quality is easy to hide. And that's kind of how we're operating as far as like how we are responding to people when they are in crisis or perceived crisis. And one of the things about the service models, it also has like an expert as a part of that, right? Like if you crack your phone screen and you take it to the mall, the person that's fixing that is the expert. And this is the same way that we treat people when we're in crisis or perceived crisis, that the doctor is the expert. So what may seem like, you know, not radical today, but was very radical in the deinstitutionalization movement is disabled people saying that we're the experts of our own lives. As Kendra talked about, what happened as the institutions began to close more rapidly is the resources that were distributed were not according to that idea that disabled people were experts or worthy or capable of actually directing our own lives, right? So like one of the big things that came out of that movement is person-centered and person-directed care, which exists within the system in many different ways. And I should acknowledge that it's like not a monolith. There are people that have gone to psych wards and institutions and have had a positive experience. But what we're acknowledging here is like the system itself is corrosive and it just expands itself much like prisons do. Like if you build them, they will fill them, and they do the same with the institutions. I mean, to the tune of something that like seems like very wild, like in Pennsylvania, two of the what they call state centers now that are open cost $400,000 per person that is in the institution to maintain and keep open. So we know it's not about profit, and that's why I lift that idea that people are actually advocating for these to exist, and that there's lobby behind that. But the pace at like what we're expecting people to like heal and learn and grow, it's like really in line with capitalism and not what we need. And that quick fix, and rather than like this deep exploration of what is creating disability, what is exacerbating it, understanding that disability is a cause and consequence of trauma and violence and poverty, is like what we really need to get to, rather than this idea that we can repair a person and fix whatever is inside of them, right? And I'll say just a couple more things is that self-determination piece has always been a part of disability movements for progress, in part because what we have in the US are movements that are operating from the frameworks that were used from in the Black radical tradition. So what happened in California, what happened with independent living, what happened with the psychiatric survivor movement, all of those are using frameworks that were given to us from the US Black South, really. So places like Mississippi and what freedom riders and whatnot were doing. And I just want to note like how it manifests in like overlaps with incarceration, and maybe we'll have time to come back to this. But I'm thinking of Natasha McKenna, somebody who was a Black woman, 37 years old, diagnosed schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, was at a rental car agency, and someone called the police because they deemed her to be acting, you know, erratically or something that they weren't comfortable with. And when the police came, they attempted to involuntarily commit her. She resisted because she didn't want to be captured and go to a place that she didn't want to go to. And that put her into the trajectory of having a warrant and then going to a jail and then being murdered by cops. But it begins with like that, taking the autonomy away from a person. So I think someone mentioned like what an institution was. Like when I'm thinking about autonomy, it's like, can you get a burrito at 3 a.m. is the test that we have for institutions. And you can't. In a lot of the court mandated mental health centers, I'm using air quotes, in group homes, in places where disabled people broadly are trapped. And I'll stop there. Maybe we'll come back to that last piece.
Dustin, I think I can speak for everybody that we're loving your momentum and your power, and we're really like there with what you're saying, and that you're not afraid to call these systems out for what they are, which I encourage everyone to do. And there will be, moments of disagreement possibly between people, panelists, and even the audience, but this is what these discussions are all about. They're not about, creating an echo chamber. We want to get to a point of, real healing and solutions, and that takes bringing up these points of view. So it is tremendously appreciated. I especially appreciate you towards the beginning speaking to the stigma of like mental health in general that exists in our society, and how that's made it become such almost an untouchable subject. And I think that has contributed to the slowness of changes in systems to help people with these sets of needs, right? And that how that impacts the individuals who are in need currently. So just bring up that discomfort around the topic, and digging into the capitalistic and racist roots of why this isn't as addressed and put into the forefront as it should be. So again, thank you. We're going to move on to the next question, which is for Marco. And I think he can also speak to what you were also talking about, Dustin, which is getting to the idea of healing cannot be, talked about as something linear or put on a certain time frame for anyone. I think that's setting people up for failure. And again, I think the next question kind of allows for more discussion about that. Again, it's from Marco. And my question is, what are the ways court-mandated treatment uses fear, punishment, and monitoring to promote compliance? And in what ways does this system often set people up for failure?
Excuse me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Marco. Dustin said it right. I mean, couldn't say it better. And as well as Grace, all of you. Working with individuals right now are people with, serious mental illness, or which we call Brad age class members. And when I hear their stories of how they try to get an ATI, the courts are simply just giving them, it's more like punishment. There's no such thing as recovery involvement. It's like, if you fail, you go to jail. So that right there makes a person, especially if they go into a mental health crisis and have substance use, they either don't want to do the recovery, and it's not going to be long lasting as long as there's a threat. Or if they do it, they don't get the right services they need. I know from my experience that when they asked me about PTSD, all they wanted me was for me to take medication. That's a prime example of how some of these treatment plans by service providers treat people. It's not even person-centered, and I think Justin mentioned that. Not engaging the client. So what they deviate is from how we actually heal a person, the healing process. It's more, for the courts, it's more like, well, if you do this, you get to go free. But every person is an individual. And the treatments that should be provided should be specialized, individualized, and comprehensive. I mean, time and time again, when I hear stories of people who got the treatment and that got worse, I mean, it's frustrating. All I can say is just listen to them and have them focus on their treatment. Looking at the jail, how the courts, especially mental health courts, some of the things that I do in mental health courts, is try to get the person to go into a treatment. But every person doesn't mean they have to go into residential. They can go to outpatient because everyone's circumstances is different. I have a client that wanted a treatment, actually requested treatment and got it, but they told him he had to go to residential. But he lost his job, he lost his apartment, and he was the only bread provider for the family. So now while he's going to treatment, he's not thinking about treatment. He's thinking about getting out to take care of his family. You know, the system's all set up for that because it's just this sanction driven. And one of the things that we're always trying to do is put a Band-Aid on it. It's like going to a doctor and you got a puncture wound, and instead of stitching them up, he gives them a Band-Aid. That's what society looks at people. And the language that they use in the courts is not, once you're in court, you are, well, allegedly committed a crime, but when you go to court, you are a defendant. That's what they call you as. Not a client, not a patient, not a participant, but a defendant. So when you go into the court, they're mandating treatment, you have to plead guilty. Well, in the state of New York, well, I don't know. And so then if they decide to give you the treatment, they decide. You have no input whatsoever. So the failure continues. Hopefully things will change. I know people mentioned about the movement. There is and we'll talk a little bit further about that, a bill that's out that's called Treatment Not Jails Act. Well, it's about to be out. We're working on the bill. And it focuses on the individual, on recovery. It's pre-plea, so you don't have to plead guilty. And well, I'll talk a little bit further about that later. But the language has to change. And how we treat people of all, you know, you say disabilities, it just doesn't have to be mental health. It could be substance use disorder, which is not, I believe, is in the DSM. So when, you know, we've continue, it's like, sometimes I just want to throw everything away and just say, I give up. But I don't do it because I know I see changes coming. And there is a lot of people like all of you here who are fighting for that. I think I've said enough.
Thank you, Marco. Your input really spoke to how much power I think that the courts have, that they shouldn't, over the features and designations of people with mental health needs and how ill-equipped they are. And we definitely look forward to hearing more about Treatments Not Jails. So we'll make sure to give some space for that later. Let's move on to the next question, which is for Yazin. So Yazin, our question for you tonight is, how do government policies, such as counterterrorism, perpetuate surveillance and profiling within mental health treatment in the name of safety?
Thank you. I also just want to name that a lot of what people have been sharing so far is really, really related, I think, to this specific context. That being said, I think there are some specifics for what specifically in counterterrorism comes up in relation to mental health. So at Vigilant Love, a lot of what we look at is how the war on terror is a multi-billion-dollar industry with moving pieces all over the world. So it's not just a domestic project. And specifically, there's this program called Countering Violent Extremism, which has recently been rebranded to be called Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, which is both domestic and transnational project. And the basic premise, like in a 30-second nutshell, because I have limited time, is that through trying to assess how to gather intelligence from communities, especially racialized Muslim communities in the United States and around the world, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, all these folks did survey work with these communities directly and asked, would you be willing to participate in informancy programs? So would you be willing to establish informancy relationships with key federal agents so that we can do a better job of weeding out terrorists from your community? And so the response was a resounding no. There were surveys like, for example, from the Arab and Arab American community where they flat out said they would never engage in informancy or these kinds of things. So back to the drawing board, the Department of Homeland Security came up with this program where they designed a system that would instead deputize social institutions, community partners, as the places where informancy work happens. So whereas previously the government is trying to connect with the people directly and the people said no, they're like, okay, who's the middle person? Where is the middle person that we can go to? And they identified community partners, because community partners already have the trust of the community members. So the government doesn't have to waste time or resources building that. They can overcome the skepticism and they can overcome privacy laws. And similarly, these community partners are dependent on government funding. So the government can finagle things and make grants have stipulations that necessitate mandatory reporting, which is where you get countering violent extremism. And this is, again, is in a nutshell. But a really basic example of how countering violent extremism works and how it is also a transnational project is the United States government has countering violent extremists or TVTP programming in Syria. And it relies a lot on social services, looks a lot at mental health, and it specifically polices political ideology, mental health, and religiosity in Syrian refugees. The United States military bombs Syria. Syrian refugees then flee Syria to escape that violence and end up here. Here in the United States, there are domestic countering violent extremist programs that target Muslim refugees that also police religiosity, political ideology, and mental health. And so this type of programming usually teaches refugees that anti-imperialism or anti-war is a sign of radicalization that can get you imprisoned. US policing is safe and unlike the policing of other countries. Cultural pride and religiosity is considered a refusal to assimilate. Being pro-Palestinian is considered terrorist, right? And these are very, very explicitly named in the countering violent extremist risk factor networks. And so when you look specifically at how mental health is weaponized, mental health is named as a risk factor in countering violent extremist frameworks, where if there are certain mental health patterns exhibited by these communities, and I'm referencing primarily Muslim or Muslim-ish communities is what we say for communities that are racialized by the war on terror. This is primarily in reference to Arab, South Asian, African American, and East African Muslim communities. Mental health includes schizophrenia, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. These are all examples that are delineated by the Department of Homeland Security as security threats to national security and as grounds to intervene in someone's case. And so what you'll have is, for example, after-school programming that's put on by the nonprofit that's funded by countering violent extremist programming. This program is dependent on this funding. They then will offer the normal programming that they might have already offered to youth or to women. But now they're also encouraged to monitor the behavior of people. They're encouraged to keep track of what is the mental health of people around you? How are they behaving? How is their religiosity playing out? Do they seem especially religious? Are youth becoming more religious? An example in Nicole Wynn, she's a scholar who's done a lot of research on countering violent extremism, especially in Minneapolis, where there's a large Somali population. Refugee youth who are depressed and sad from being forced to relocate because of war, that depression is considered an indicator of extremism or likelihood to commit extremism. And so what's important here is that everything is depoliticized, right? The United States is entirely culpable in the cause of this specific case of depression or PTSD. The United States is culpable in the migration of refugees to the United States when they're bombing these countries, right? But none of that is really referenced. Instead, the anger of youth and the frustration of youth at the United States is what's being criminalized. Their mental health and their trauma, their reactions to that is what's being criminalized. And we've seen cases throughout the United States over time of youth who are incarcerated or deported through national security frameworks for expressing suicidal ideation by expressing interest in becoming a fighter against US military in countries that are currently being occupied by the United States military. We've seen youth who have autism, who've been entrapped and incarcerated through CVE frameworks because of their entirely like misconstrued claims to wanting to be part of a movement. We've seen youth case studies in England of youth who've had OCD triggered by being surveilled by programs like this. And so the overlaps with mental health goes both ways, which is also really important to name. The existing mental health of people who are traumatized by the state is criminalized. And also this surveillance is causing a lot of mental health impacts that we're also working on naming in our campaign, Services Not Surveillance. And I think lastly, in regards to refugee health specifically, what's important to name is that the refugee experience is traumatizing. Many refugees are traumatized by war. They get diagnosed with PTSD and then are also traumatized by the scarcity of support for the refugee cause in the United States. Being poor is traumatizing. Being homeless is traumatizing, right? Not speaking a language and having to provide for your family, these are all very traumatizing things. And so I think it's really important to think about how racialized and classed and ableist a lot of these frameworks are. And I know I have about a minute left, I'm presuming, right? Okay, great. The last thing I wanted to name is very specifically how mental health is mapped out in CBE. So there are mental health task forces. It's a collaboration between police, federal agents, and social workers who then take on a specific case. So I've named examples of youth. These people are then in conversation with each other, privileged conversations, and they assess what is the likelihood of this person being a threat to themselves or to others? And here you see that same problematic framing of concern for themselves or for others to actually legitimize criminalizing this person. And so Victoria named earlier LA as an example. This is how the LA programming works. LAPD and the Department of Mental Health have collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security, where the LAPD are deputized to assess people's mental health and decide whether or not they're a national security threat. And so I think this is really important to unpack, is how much national security plays a role in criminalizing mental health, and also how specifically national security becomes a vacuum and a loophole where privacy laws don't apply anymore. This is a lot of how CBE is getting through, is that national security invalidates privacy laws, and that includes HIPAA. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yazen. Again, another panelist and comments that I think are inciting a lot of thought in the chat. I feel like a particular connection to you and your background because I come from a family that is actually, my family came here to this country as refugees. They were displaced by the Salvadorian Civil War, as most Salvadorian immigrants in this country were, and we were absolutely brutalized in that Civil War for over a decade. The United States was very much an active agent and aggressor and funder, pouring billions of dollars behind that war. So I'm very interested in the topic of how the protecting the mental health and assessing how the displacement has affected refugees and how they've ended up becoming targeted in the United States for daring to be affected by their experiences. So again, I sincerely appreciate you bringing such a big, broad scope to this topic and applying it to a population that isn't, I don't think, getting the concern that they deserve, right? Considering I don't think people are aware of the extent of the surveillance that is going on. So I really appreciate you bringing light to that topic. Now we're going to go into another audience question. And again, I encourage all of our panelists to listen out and go ahead and bring in your point of view if you feel like you have, something to connect to this question. Because it really, I think that all of you have such a distinct point of view and specialization, and we want to give you all as much time to connect with the audience as possible. So the question is, how can we empower and validate individuals as experts of their own experiences, especially as it relates to self-diagnosis? How do we mitigate institutional gatekeeping, systemic biases, and power differentials, considering professionals and their role in diagnosis and subsequent treatment? And I'll leave that out to whoever might want to respond.
I'll go ahead. I don't have an answer, but I think it's incredibly an important thing to do and to consider when we know the systems, the powerful systems that prevent people from getting the care that they want, that they're seeking. And I mean, just like speaking for myself, I moved from Ottawa, one city in Canada, to another city in Canada, Montreal, and I was seeing a psychiatrist in Ottawa for 3 years, and I wanted to see one here just to follow up on my treatment. I was wanting that care, and they put me on a wait list for a year. I'm still waiting to see a therapist, and I want that treatment. And it's just, I already have the diagnosis, so I am able to seek out the care that I want and that I need. But even with that knowledge, it's impossible to. And then on top of that, you add the fact that people know that they're experiencing, they know their experiences and what they're feeling. And that can only become validated if a person with a certain degree determines them as having this. Then all of a sudden they can get all the services that they need. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. I just think it's an incredible, I don't have solutions to it, but I think it's an incredibly important thing that we have to start moving towards more and more, is honoring self-diagnosis and self-representation.
I think if it's all right, also regarding the second question. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please go for it.
I just wanted to say this, Marco. So there's a team that does, or should I say a person that does the assessment, right? They have the assessment tools to determine the person's diagnosis. I think that should definitely involves the individual, engage the individual, because there's a lot more to say than what you have on the record, on writing. And then the person decides with the clinician, let's say, what is that? How do you envision your recovery? Really get involved. As Justin said, person-centered, and getting involved where the person feels comfortable, has the power, not just feel like you're mandating, you're throwing this at me, and if I do it this way, I will get punished. And I give an example where a person has not only a mental health condition, but a substance use disorder. If a person right now in the courts, if they go through the court mandated and they relapse, they either get remanded or go to jail. They go right back to trial, criminal court, no matter, even if they have a serious mental illness. And that's the problem what they have in the system right now, is that you dare to fail. I mean, it's you either do it this way or it's the highway. That's it. And the participant, I like to call it participant, has no say so in their recovery. Again, and I'm also blame the service providers. In some cases in New York State or New York City, from my experiences and others, is that some of these service providers are not good. They simply not good. I've heard supportive housing places that are terrible, SROs, just individuals, personal individuals that supposed to be case managers there to serve you, but they push you away. So, that has to change a lot. Thank you.
One thing I wanted to name in addition, I think on the systemic bias and power differentials, is that working across disciplines and working across communities is really, really, really important, which I think this is already, it seems, a really important point for IDHA. But I know that a lot of how we've been able to learn so many different moving pieces of how national security is being weaponized against the Muslim community, and specifically how mental health is being weaponized, is by connecting with folks who work in law, folks who are service providers, folks who are community members that are impacted, people who are organizers. I think that a lot of us have very different experiences, and we're intentionally siloed. But because of these kinds of cross communal interactions, It allows us, like, for example, now we're working on developing a resource list of who are the people you shouldn't be going to, who are the people that have accepted money from the Department of Homeland Security that you will be at risk at if you seek services from them in Los Angeles County. Similarly, who can you go to, right? And we're working on doing this vetting and this power mapping in a lot of the CVE hotspots across the country. That's Vigilant Love, and that's also in partnership with Stop CVE, which is a national coalition of organizers, but really naming in that vein of what we have to do for ourselves. There are a lot of radical service providers who know I shouldn't write certain things down. I shouldn't report certain things. Like, those people do exist. And I think restoring faith in the fact that we all deserve support is something that's really important and really hard, but a huge premise of why we need this campaign is we experience a lot of trauma from the state, and we need to heal that trauma as well. And there are service providers, there are grassroots organizations who know that, who believe in that, who are invested in making that happen. And so I think just also thinking about the people that are in those spaces that are co-opted, they're aware of it, and some of them are very, very much invested in dismantling it as much as we are.
Thank you so much for those phenomenal answers. Again, I think you all brought very different, pieces of answers together that I very much appreciate, and highlights the need for these discussions and the range of expertise that's necessary to come to the best solutions. We have a second audience question for this portion. We've noticed a lot of youth in the chat, and we see you. So this is definitely for y'all. We want y'all to know that you are seen, you are recognized, and we're all really committed to not accepting the system as it is, to breaking things down to ensure that the future is better, because this can't continue on for more generations. It has to stop here. And I think all of us are very much committed to that fight in our own ways and capacities, right? So the question is, for anybody who wants to chime in, can you speak to the nuance of utilizing abolitionist and anti-oppressive practices when working with youth who have inherently less autonomy and authority over their lives and must often defer to the treatment choices that parents or caretakers make for them?
I can kick it off as
Awesome.
a parent,
Yes,
because
I love
I
it.
think that, so my daughter is now 20, so she is a technically a grown person, but I think that part of it is, because the doctors or medical professionals are going to go to the parents first, right? So trying to equip your child with the idea that it's their body, it's their choice, to paraphrase that, so you don't need to, acquiesce to whatever it is that this doctor is saying or this other person is saying. And I don't know if people who work with youth can also try to empower them to say, have a conversation with your parents, because I'm coming at this as from an abolitionist perspective, as somebody who does not believe in involuntary psychiatric commitment or confining people for quote unquote their own good. Other parents might say, I want what's best for my child, and this person in a white lab coat is telling, I'm going to slow down, and this person in a white lab coat is telling me that the best thing for my child, whom I am very, very, very worried about, is to put them in this place behind a locked door for 2 weeks. And I am so afraid that my child will die or some bad thing will happen that I will acquiesce to this because I don't know what to do. So I think that for people who work with youth, it's also talking to them about how to talk to their parents or how to involve their parents or caregivers. If their parents are not so open or receptive to these ideas, who might they be receptive to hearing this from as well, and sort of building up those kinds of supports for youth, because they don't legally have that autonomy. So if at any point when my daughter was younger, I had decided that I wanted her to get this kind of coercive treatment or that kind of coercive treatment as a parent, I would have the legal right to do that. So perhaps while we can't at this point, without like a huge fraught battle, give youth that kind of autonomy, we can empower them to have these conversations with their parents, or perhaps if they're not comfortable doing so, figuring out ways that other people might intercede with the people who have that legal authority to say, you know, it's not always the person with the lab coat or with the chart that actually knows your child best and knows what's best for them. Why don't we take a step back for a minute, listen, and figure out other ways? Because the youth might say, like, you know, what I really just wanted was a place to talk and to vent. If I'm feeling suicidal or like hurting myself, it might not be that I need to be locked up for 2 weeks. I might have needed just a safe person to talk to about this and help me work through why I'm feeling this way and how I can get through this. Not bad, you know, this is dangerous. We're going to lock you up. We're going to subject you to all of these other violations of your bodily autonomy, and we're not going to make you want to ever seek help again. So that's coming from me as a non-social work, non-professional place, but also as somebody who is a parent who has had to navigate situations in which I've had to talk to my daughter, and depending on the age and the relationship of the youth, they may not be that open to talking. It might be many conversations before you kind of get to the root of it, when they're like, yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah, I'm fine. But again, giving them those tools and trying to equip them with this idea that they can also advocate for themselves, which is also something that we want everybody to have. So why not start young?
Thank you
This
so
is
much. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Dustin. I could just briefly add kind of what Victoria was talking about. Just building on that is like political education, I would say. And I'd say that is thinking about like when I'm interacting and I'm in conversation with kids, especially the ones that are in jail, it's incredibly sad. It's a lot of things as to how many times they've been told like that they're the problem, or they have done something to be there, or they triggered that, or they're the reason for that. So one of the things that we found helpful is for them to be able to situate themselves within a larger social context to understand the things around them, and even the literal building that they're in, like what that building is for, what it does, like who works there, like how people get paid, where that money comes from, like who is depending on them to be in there in that maroon jumpsuit with the shoes with no laces on them. Like that's been one of the most empowering things. And then I would say that parents to know the rights too. As myself, as somebody that it felt like the entire project was to figure out what was wrong with me. Like Victoria said, when my parents took me to the hospital, they were then relinquishing like that parenting to the system itself, which was their way to parent, like because they didn't understand that, you know, I could be held after 72 hours. They didn't understand that they can't get me back from the system. They didn't understand that what coercive medication does to somebody. So to have them equipped with that knowledge and to know what their rights are as parents and what their children's rights are super important.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm glad that we hit a question that speaks to the youth, speaks to the directly impacted, right? And also allows you guys to bring your perspectives as people directly impacted, and also those supportive of those with mental health needs. So again, I think this question brings things into very people-centered space, which I appreciate. And I think that our discussion so far has had a great balance of, you know, kind of a little bit of policy, a little bit of like social structure, as well as what we can do to help people struggling in the now. And that's something that I think is very unique and I really appreciate. So these next questions are very much close to my heart as, again, a community organizer, somebody that works with people. I'm a South Bronx native, as I said in the beginning. So a lot of my passion and how this is not just like a career for me, right? Or, like this is everything that I do as far as like advocacy and community organizing comes from my own experiences and wanting to change things because of the ways that I've been impacted by broken systems, but also the people in my community. People with mental health needs and the incarcerated are not my clients. They're my close friends. They're family. You know what I mean? So we are making space for questions that look to how we can help people actively, and the resource and using all this incredible panel of a broad range of expertise to feed into resources that people tuning in right now can use and share. So the first question along that line of thought is, what are the mental health resources and advocacy groups in our communities that are creating radical change in the approach to mental health? Aside from IDHA, of course, who is hosting the event tonight. So I'll leave that question out in the air for anybody, and please feel free to chime in.
This is Marco. As I was saying earlier during my talk about the Treatment Not Jails Act, is a campaign that is trying to push a bill to amend Article 216. And right now under Article 216, only people with substance use disorders charged with certain drug felony charges are eligible for diversion. The language that's used in this bill opens it up for disabilities, whether it's TBIs, personality disorders, and much more. And the other thing that I said earlier was that also we're looking for, if you go to a diversion program, you no longer have to plead guilty in order to find, an ATI, alternative to incarceration. Why it's so critical? Because now if you have a rap sheet, now you're going to be stigmatized, not only with a mental health condition, but now as a, formerly incarcerated. It also changes the language from a defendant to a participant. So you're involved, the whole idea of the courts looking at, and the judges and the DA looking at this participant as someone who needs treatment and deserves treatment, not being punished. Some of the other things in the bill, which, we'll be here all day talking about, but it changes the way how treatment is. We talked about it earlier, all of us, about person-centered, about the clinicians finding, and unfortunately we have a lot of cases where we find people underdiagnosed or overdiagnosed. So we got people, clinicians who would use the proper assessment tools in order to make that diagnosis. And then the treatment plan being used, engaging the client or the participant. Now, as far as punishment, we no longer want to see when a person relapses, because relapse is part of recovery. In substance use, you're going to tell me you're going to go cold turkey and never use again? I mean, some people could do it, but chances are you ain't going to do it. So why will you be punished if you have a disease? It's like almost you go in for an emergency room to get stitches and it breaks, and all of a sudden you get punished because of the stitches broke. So this bill has a lot of promising changes, and it slowly decarcerates, especially in New York, involving New York City. And it looks at the people with mental health concerns not as criminals, because that's how what someone was mentioning, one of the panelists mentioned, is that we always don't want to just, oh, he did this, he did that, he's got a criminal mental health illness. We don't want to deal with it. Lock him up. That's what it is in our society right now. Everything is punitive. We're working towards a more just more compassionate society, right? And I remember in school I had to do a piece a paper on restorative justice, and I use like the indigenous people in like in Canada and in the United States who have these elders who decide what type of punishment a person gets. It involves the whole community, and that's where Treatment Not Jails campaign talks about, and building community is that we have to have the community get involved in the person, because most people are coming home. People don't understand whatever crime you committed, most people are coming home. They be your neighbors, your family members, your loved ones, friends. They're coming home, and if you have to get involved. If not, it's a cycle. We are never going to get rid of jails. So, thank you. Oh, I forgot to mention, I put on the chat, there is the link, or should I say the person of contact, to talk a little bit more about the bill and the campaign, and then hopefully it will pass. I'm sure it will.
I think something I also wanted to add on to that is in our campaign, so we have a campaign called Services Not Surveillance, and the big picture goal is really separating the relationship of the Department of Homeland Security from mental health institutions in the United States, and really taking national security out of the therapy room. And so through our own work and our coalition, we work with service providers, with academics, and with organizers to develop analysis on like updates on how CVE is mapping out and playing out, and specifically how mental health is co-opted. And we provide community members with case studies of like, how has this happened? I think also with that, we have created a value statement that I'll share here. And what we've been doing is we've been encouraging service providers or agencies and grassroots organizations to sign on. And the basic commitment is, I will not accept funding from the Department of Homeland Security. I will not criminalize or racialize my patient or my client through this lens. And as we are building the campaign more outward facing, right now we've been doing a lot of mapping of what's happening so we can more thoughtfully engage in the work, right? That's one of the things that we will be expanding on, is making sure that folks are aware of the value statement, that folks who are going into a therapy room can take it with them and say, hey, this is something that I've heard about. Is this something that you'd be willing to agree to before I become one of your patients? And vice versa, service providers inviting them to learn more about how national security is weaponized. A lot of service providers I've met had no idea that this was even taking place, which is, I think, really illustrative of how secretive national security is. Last but not least, if people are interested in learning more about this coalition that I'm naming through our own work in Vigilant Love, or if they're interested more broadly in learning about countering violent extremism on the national level, there are a lot of cities that are really, really impacted by this type of programming. There is a coalition called Stop CVE, and they have a health justice team as well. And they've been doing this on the national level of building out who are the partners that we can't trust anymore, who are the nonprofits, who are the doctor's offices that have accepted the money. So I'm gonna go ahead and throw my email into the chat. And if you're interested in learning more about either of these things, I'd be really happy to connect with you.
Hi, this is Kendra. I guess I can go next here. There's so many groups in Canada, and I appreciate many carceral abolition and harm reduction grassroots groups that we have here in so-called Canada. One that I was involved in as a student is an abolitionist group called Criminalization and Punishment Education Program, CPEP, C-P-E-P. And they do a lot of different campaigns. They have this jail phone line in which people who are incarcerated are able to call to the jail line for free and just express what they're witnessing, what they're experiencing on the inside, to relay messages to their families and their loved ones, which is a privilege that a lot of folks don't have when they're incarcerated. Another really excellent group is the Toronto Prisoners' Rights Project. They work a lot with CPEP. I think they do a lot of excellent work as well. The Ottawa Street Medics, they are a grassroots group, a mutual aid group that does a lot of excellent work on the ground. There's Overdose Prevention Ottawa. It's a safe inject group. Then there's Insight in Vancouver, which was the first legal supervised drug injection site in North America. They provide supervised health-focused location for injection drug use, primarily heroin. They have medical staff on premises. And then in Montreal, where I'm situated, there's a Projet Suivi Communautaire, which offers services aimed at ensuring well-being and quality of life of people living with mental health issues. There's, and then I'll end with, I have so many here. There's Le Raccord, so that's RACOR, Santé Mentale, and they are an alternative community network of mental health organizations here in Montreal with the mission to support and equip and represent the community in an alternative way that is not as punitive and carceral as we've been talking about today in mental health work. But yeah, thank you.
Hey, this is Dustin. I won't spend too much time, but I'll say that there's groups like, there's a group I'm with in Atlanta called Us Protecting Us, and it's like non-disabled and disabled folks coming together to understand police violence impacts disabled people at disproportionate rates, and building out community supports as to how do we respond to each other in crisis without the police, and then what happens when the police gets there. And that is like really like a skill share. Almost everywhere there's recovery groups. I would also like think about like the self-organizing that happens inside of prisons. Like we know that the prison system doesn't provide care, and I would point to almost any lifer group that's in prisons, especially women's prisons. They have given us a lot of ways in which they've cared for each other. I would recommend folks maybe read Vicky's book about resistance behind bars, women in prison. Also a part of that, there's a group called Let's Get Free, the Women and Trans Prisoner Defense Committee. And one of the ways on the outside to be in solidarity is like we've been doing letters from home every week since the pandemic started. So also to think about ways that this could be reciprocal. Sending comic books and magazines into prisons is one way. There's a lot of book programs that sends books into prisons, and from that you can start your own reading group with folks and things like that. And I could list off like a bunch of, you know, organizations that I know, but I want to say that one of the most important things is to not think about this as something that we have to outsource all of the time. And the way in which we provide mental health support is by being in community in a way that we might not be now. And that it's possible to do things that don't seem like very formal. Like I'm thinking about one of my cousins who is in recovery, him and his twin brother, for almost 7 years. They've in and out of jail, experienced a bunch of trauma. But Aaron started this group called Motivation Don't Die just because he posted it on a hashtag. And this is in Southwest Wyoming, in a place that is not, you know, filled with universities and academics or programs really. And they just started barbecuing together. They started holding panels, didn't call them a panel. That wasn't the intention. And they really created community amongst folks that were in recovery. And it's been a space where family can connect. So I'm thinking about the ways in which like that provides mental health support. Like also, and the last thing I'll say is like, there's a place in Pittsburgh, in Braddock, or a borough of Pittsburgh, where we just threw like what became a high school dance party. It started off as like, we just want to have music and food. But that is like one of the spaces for youth to get together, along with the library, and thinking about how we can expand those spaces to mean something else. Like the library there has a print shop, it has a basketball court, so privileged in that regard. But it is a place where people spend a lot of time. And I often view that as a part of how we support each other too.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think we could go on and on, resource sharing. And I'm glad that you all were so willing to, give people actionable items, next step, or places to find support. I love Dustin's contribution and point that, community really is healing. So you don't have to wait for, it's great to, reach out to organizations local to you and find where you can be of help, but you'd be really surprised at the power that you have, even if you don't feel like, you're somebody that can make a difference. Let this conversation empower you into recognizing that if you want to help yourself and help people around you that are struggling, it really can start with you. And even a conversation and maybe a weekly Zoom call with only a couple of people in a community can make such a tremendous difference and kind of get the ball rolling on this wave of healing. So don't forget the power that you have as an individual. I'll say that to everyone listening. So our next question, again, for everyone is, and this is really a shout out to the mental health practitioners that are in the audience. We see you, we appreciate you coming into the space. It's very easy to be a practitioner in a system that is, as we've learned, damage and causes a lot of harm, to just kind of go along with that and, be like, my job is set before me, there are rules, and to decide to stick to that. And those of you that are resisting and are using your education and your positionality to make things different, and are coming to these spaces and engaging with conversations that are transformative, we want to give you something to work off of. So if our panelists could speak to, kind of get a last little bit of information out succinctly. This is a question that we have, again, targeted to the audience of, and I think this will be something that a lot of people will take something out of, but it's our cue and note to those who are practitioners in the system. What advice would you give to a mental health worker or clinician to reduce the carcerality of their profession? How to do less harm? So again, I'll open that up to the audience or our panelists.
I think one very basic thing, if it's okay just to name, which has kind of been stated and throughout, is, and what a lot of us are working on developing, is knowing where national security voids HIPAA on a very practical level, because it does. And there are very many different ways that we've seen youth and adults as well be criminalized based on what they've shared with someone that is either a service provider or a social worker. And so I think that is one thing alone that's really important. And specifically, I think the difference between, I think that we a lot of times lump together how like the carceral state works, but there are differences. And I think familiarizing ourselves between the differences of the national security apparatus versus the prison industrial complex, there are definitely overlaps. I think especially the work that Victoria does in like naming, there are a lot of different ways that they work together, but it's important to understand what the nuances are. If the person that I'm providing services to is an immigrant, is undocumented, is a refugee, is part of a community that's racialized as a terroristic threat, as opposed to just a racialized threat, which the scope of who is an extremist or who is a terrorist is broadening, but there really is a strong relationship between the war on terror and countering violent extremism that's important. And I think I'm dropping an example of a story that I'm sure many of folks heard about, the notes that were seized from a service provider that was used in deporting an immigrant youth and undocumented youth, right? And that's just one thing that I think is important.
I don't know how much surveillance people who are social workers and service providers are under, but somebody on this panel earlier said not everything needs to be written down. So that is something, like if somebody comes to you and expresses something that technically you are supposed to report and have them locked up or have some other more coercive treatment done to them because they have said, I've been feeling really stressed and I have been self-harming. I am feeling really stressed. I have been self-medicating. I am feeling very stressed. I'm thinking of hurting myself. Perhaps that, you know, perhaps you don't need to hit that button. And again, I say this as somebody who has never gone to social work school or counseling school or therapy school, so I don't know how monitored people are, but this is a suggestion. Just like sometimes we don't write down things that we don't seem as important, you don't need to write that down in your notes. Maybe you can add it afterwards if you really, really feel like there, you know, you have to, but you don't need to put that in right away. You don't need to hit that panic button. You don't need to say, oh, gee, you're wearing a short sleeve shirt today and I noticed that there are cuts on your arms. I'm going to immediately stop the session, get a big burly security guard to come and take you to the psychiatric treatment center. Maybe it could be a conversation. It could be like, hey, what's happening? And maybe the person might say, yeah, I was really stressed the other day because we are all stressed under this pandemic. And, you know, and it got to be too much and I did this, but now I'm feeling much better. Done. It is not, you know, the end all be all. So it could also be that you don't actually have to hit that panic button all the time, because people make decisions of actions based on all the time as to whether or not you're going to report this or report that. I mean, we see this, to jump a little bit into a different type of service provider in prenatal services, when affluent, mostly white women, cisgender women, go to the doctor and they are pregnant, and then they say like, oh yeah, you know, I had some wine, or, you know, I fell off the wagon and I had some substance that is contraindicated for pregnancy. Most of the time that doctor does not pick up the phone, call 911 and say, this person has endangered her fetus and we need to lock her up and send her to drug treatment for her own good, blah, 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 blah. They say, oh, you know, Mrs. Smith or Mrs. Jones, you know, like, you know, that's not good for the baby, blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about this. And this person is treated like somebody who slipped. They're not treated as, you know, we must lock them up for their own good and for their baby's good. And we also see that when people who are poorer and often of color go to their prenatal visit and disclose that they might have used an illicit substance or a substance that's contraindicated for their pregnancy, they get a very different treatment. So we know that there is kind of a wide latitude as to what service providers decide that they're going to hit the panic button on, what they don't. And those are often formed, as Kendra said earlier, with the mental health system by race biases, class biases, gender identity biases. So, you know, maybe people can then say, well, you know, if you were a very privileged white person, I would be talking to you more. I wouldn't necessarily be getting you locked up. And so maybe we could just treat people as if, let's find out where they're at, and not, you know, we're going to hit a button and get you locked up, whether it is, you know, because you are exhibiting some sort of mental health crisis or you need help, or simply because the law says you need to report this.
I'll jump in. This is Kendra. I think a lot of folks are doing this just by the fact of being here tonight, but I would say think critically. So like challenge what you've been taught in your school. And like from my own training in psychology, I know that a lot of what we're taught is super essentialist and often void of any power analysis. So there's no consideration of how racism and classism and ableism, sex, how these things play into how we understand the human mind. So I highly recommend looking into the works of mad writers and thinkers, of prison abolitionists. My eyes were really especially opened by the book Disability Incarcerated, Imprisonment and Disability in the US and Canada, edited by Liat Ben Moshe. Just this book really helped understand the connections between different forms of confinement, institutionalization, and power structures, and it's super, super enlightening. So continue to think critically about what you've been taught, and really challenge the types of things that the essentialist notions that you might have been informed.
Thank you all so much. I think that question, as a lot of the questions tonight, led to a lot of powerful thoughts that hopefully our audience can has left tonight with a lot of takeaways. Again, galvanized to take action and continue with these conversations. So a quick note before I close out. I want to make a special note that Jesse has a very special announcement to share right after me, that you'll be really excited and you want to be a part of this. So please stick around just for a few more minutes. I appreciate your hanging in there and staying engaged with this event. Stay right there. I see you trying to exit out of Zoom. Don't do it. Jesse has a super special surprise announcement that you won't want to miss. Trust me on this one. Okay, so let's take a deep breather and really, take in what we've engaged with tonight. It's some really serious topics that can bring up a lot of feelings for all of us, those of us involved with the event, the panelists, and especially the audience. I don't know about you all, but I feel even more empowered and ready to fight and create change after this discussion. I definitely got goosebumps several times as I heard our immensely passionate panelists bring light to some serious truths of some very broken systems. I want to say thanks again to all of our incredible panelists. Be sure to follow them on their social medias and support their work. Amplify them and bring these conversations into normalized places, right? It's up to us to decide that these are things that are allowed to be talked about in public and everywhere. And that's how systemic change is created. Thank you to the very hardworking IDHA team who made this event possible, Jesse, Lee, Liza. They are our invisible heroes of the night. And thank you for tuning in and for your phenomenal questions that led to brilliant conversations. So discussions like the one we've witnessed this evening, which allow us a space to discuss the systems that are tearing apart our communities, are vital to shaping a future in which community care and self-determination are not only respected, but uplifted as necessary principles for healing. On a very serious and personal note, we've all been affected by the failures of the psychiatric care, incarceration, and mental health systems. And I want to make a moment to honor that, the very real hurt that exists and the urgency that that's created for us to take action and demand change in our time. We will eternally mourn those we've lost to the damages of systemic psychiatric trauma in a society which gave people so few options, whose lives could have been saved through measures of community care and real healing. For them and for all neurodivergent and disabled futures, we need to fight and movement build tirelessly, no matter the opposition ahead of us, to build a better future and ensure it. So let's use our inherent strength, gifts, and wisdom mindfully and with great intention. Let's open our minds to the information presented to us by our brilliant panelists tonight. And let's put ourselves in the mindset to build it together and actively create change with the new knowledge we have taken in. So I have a serious question for everybody, and I really want you to take this personally. Do you believe in systemic transformative change? I know it's possible, and I won't rest until I see it happen in our time. So join me and join IDHA. Let's all take our power back by learning how these systems of coercion and control fail us and how we can demand real change. I know a revolution is possible. Revolutions have happened throughout human history, so why not now? And a revolution lives in these spaces. I'm immensely grateful to IDHA for creating this space for such powerful conversations to take place, like the one we just engaged in. IDHA does so much work around transformative mental health, and we strive to have as much of our funding come directly from the community as possible. If you feel so inclined, please make a contribution today. Your donations will make more of these conversations possible, so if you're able, please consider making a contribution. Again, thank you all. I send all my love. Please stay in touch. Find me on my social medias and stay engaged. I encourage you to embrace your power and continue to engage in these dialogues and with activism and community support. And with that, I pass it on to Jesse.
Thank you so much, Grace. And thank you to all of our incredible panelists. I am speechless, honestly, and looking forward to watching this back many, many times over. And if you guys would just stick around for 1 minute, I have an exciting update, and Lee, if we can get the slides up for that. All right, so the announcement is, this is kind of the first that anyone's hearing of this. We are just launching our registration tonight for IDA's Spring 2021 class series. And what I want you all to know is that there is a team of incredibly dedicated, committed, inspiring organizers called IDA's Training Committee who have poured hours, weeks, months of work into this series, which is called Psychologies of Liberation, Human Arts in a Global Context. And I think we've spotlit the interpreter now. I just want to pause to make sure that, yes, great. So Psychologies of Liberation is going to be our next series, launching now. And Lee, if you go to the next slide. So it's a 4-part class, and you can see, we can drop this in the chat as well for accessibility, but the session titles: Unsettling Global Mental Health, Unpacking Power, Epistemic Justice and Coloniality, Global Grassroots Responses, Weaving Together Healing and Social Justice, Applications of Two-Eyed Seeing, Indigenous Practices for Social and Emotional Well-Being, and Mutual Accompaniment and the Liberation of Psychology, Widening Circles of Solidarity. And this series, if we go to the next slide, really seeks to explore injustices in global mental health and present grassroots.
I'm sorry. Interpreter speaking. Can you go back to the last slide, please, for the title?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So yes, this series seeks to explore injustices in global mental health and present grassroots liberatory responses from around the world. We can put this text in the chat. I'm respectful of everybody's time, but really I just want to invite you all to join IDA for this 4-part virtual series, which is launching now, and I think can help continue the conversation that our amazing panelists have initiated this evening. And one last slide, and then we can close, which is just to say that, as people have noted in the chat, we are recording this event. We'll send you the recording, a resource list, the chat anonymized, the full transcript of the transcription in the next few days. And we encourage you to tag us on social media if you were inspired, if there are parts of this conversation that stay with you. And yeah, I just immense gratitude to everyone who was part of making tonight possible. Panelists, access team, ASL interpreters, our captioners, and all of you. So I think we can take down the slides, and just if everyone wants to maybe turn on their video and wave a last goodbye. And thank you all for being with us. It's been an immense honor.